All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Ethan,
And I'm Nick.
and this is episode 9 of season 2 of Unexceptional Americans podcast. Today, we are joined by a very special guest, Member of Parliament Matthew Green, who is the Member of Parliament for Hamilton Center and is member of the New Democratic Party. Matthew, it's nice to see you.
Super happy to be here, man. I'm really digging the podcast platform as of late. So I appreciate the very kind invitation for me to join you and the folks that tune in to your program.
Yeah, it's definitely great to have you on here because we have reached out to a lot of people recently and want to talk about more Canadian issues as well. We are the Unexceptional Americans podcast, but just to give you kind of a bit of a personal introduction, I'm currently studying at McGill University in Montreal. So even though I'm American, I'm kind of interested in some Canadian issues as well. And so we just want to kind of talk about some of these issues that we've been seeing in Canada, because as you're very aware of, a lot of people on the left in the United States like to act as if Canada is some kind of paradise, but obviously it's not. And of course, that is something that you've talked a lot about, and that we should, that is a very big issue in 2020 and in Canadian politics in general. So first of all, I'd just like to ask if you could introduce yourself briefly, talk about your background in politics and kind of how you became a member of parliament and what are some of the most important issues to you.
Yeah, for sure. Like many people, in Hamilton, we've spent a lot of time here. I was a city councilor before. I'll start with that. And I went to city council because I didn't explicitly see myself or my values reflected necessarily in the political parties. So I knew that I wanted to, fundamentally contribute to my neighborhood. And I ran as a city councilor in 2014, was elected on October 27th as the first person of African Canadian descent in our city's history, really wanting to take on the critical issues of longstanding policies of gentrification, policies of the containment of the social pressures, poverty, mental health, food insecurity, addictions and drug use, organized crime, all these things that are challenging our inner city. And I felt that for too long, we had people making decisions who didn't even live here, quite frankly. And they were very pro-development and not pro-community. So I ran, having done some like community organizing. And I know that's a term that's like loosely used by anybody on the left who gets into politics. And it can mean a lot of different things to different people. For me, what community organizing looked like was spending 4 or 5 years in the church basements, the mosques, the community centers, organizing on asset-based community development, which basically looked like having residents take a greater position on the decisions that were being made in our community, and then culminated in organizing a coalition to push back against the construction of a major inner city casino in a community that we knew had a life expectancy of 61 years, knowing that proximity to casinos exacerbate problem gambling. So we knew by evidence-based research and data that a casino would have a very stark and predatory effect on our residents in downtown Hamilton. So when we undertook to take it on, we were taking on some of our city's most powerful people, some of the country's most powerful people, a guy by the name of Paul Godfrey, who was like a right-wing publishing magnate with the National Post and others, a guy by the name of Rod Phillips, who now happens to be a minister provincially, who both tried to push this project in Hamilton along with private developers and local very, very well-financed interests. They told us that it was a done deal, that we were going to get crushed. And then they tried to sell us on a horse and pony show about how it was actually going to help our community. And then we fought back and they underestimated us, and then we won. And that was where I recognized that I couldn't spend my time asking elected officials to do the right thing, that we needed to get a seat at the table where the valuable and critical insider information would help us in the future to stave off these types of predatory developments.
Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. That's awesome. Then it's awesome that you guys are able to have that victory. Of course, we all know too well that a lot of times most of the time these things will end in the favor of the big developers or in the big money interests. But I guess to kind of follow up on what you just said, what do you think you have seen since you got to Ottawa that has given maybe like I don't know, some fresh perspective on how difficult it is to fight back against this kind of interest, and not just in the United States, of course, but in Canada as well. The the power of big money in politics and the power of just the vested interests that have a very strong material interest in preserving the system can often have a significant negative effect on even politicians with the best intentions. So how have you kind of combated that and avoided those kinds of pressures since you've been an MP?
Well, I think that my principle, both as a city councilor and as an MP, are based on the fact that I am willing to take a principled position that may not get me reelected, that I am willing to take a principled position that may make me the target of big moneyed interest developers, special interest groups, lobbyists who happen to oppose my worldview. I know that to be true, and I'm okay with it. And that is liberation theory in politics. When you stop worrying about getting reelected and only focus on doing the things that you feel are within your scope in principle, then it becomes much easier. But what I recognized as a city councilor was that there was big money relative, and again, it's a relative thing, right? Because the scale and scope of corruption and corporate capture of the American system is something to behold. It is the most utterly corrupt and corrupted so-called democracy that you would ever come across in the world. The scale and the magnitude is second only to maybe state capitalist China or Russia. And I say that because in Canada, our max donations aren't huge. We have a very new and burgeoning third-class, third-party electoral system. We don't have super PACs here. We don't have union or corporate donations here. But we still definitely have the ultra wealthy being able to weigh in on issues in ways that the average working class cannot. Case in point, we have American hedge funds own one of our national news outlets, the National Post. They control the narratives of mainstream media. The infiltration of American style talking head punditry has seeped over into Canada. And so I think that's where we're caught. But what I recognized as a city councilor, Ethan, is that I was only treating the symptoms of bad policy. And that if I wanted to make real and lasting change, if I wanted to disrupt neoliberalism, which is the buzzword for this corporatist capitalism that both conservatives and liberals support, then I had to do it at Ottawa. I had to. There's no amount of advocacy and work that I could do at the city level that would stop the crushing effects of the commodification of housing and real estate markets, the privatization of healthcare, of mental health, the criminalization of people who use drugs. Those are all things that had to come at a much higher and national scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And so kind of at the national scale, and we've seen in the last election, the NDP actually lost seats. How do you, and for a lot of different reasons, obviously, but how do you see the path forward, again, keeping in mind those principles that are so important, of course, and that is really the only reason to be in politics, but how do you see the path forward to the NDP potentially gaining more power and, of course, hopefully someday becoming a majority government in Ottawa? How do you see the path forward to that? What's your theory of change, I guess?
My theory of change is, one of that would require democratic reform in order for that to be a thing, simply because much like the States, we have a bicameral system that doesn't favor multiple parties, that we have a system that was designed for two parties in the 1800s, favoring the propertied European settler class against everybody else. And we still have that same system today. And so what we have is, I would share this with your American listeners. For me, to be a member of the Democratic Party would be a special place in either purgatory or hell. And I'm not sure which one, because I couldn't imagine sharing a caucus with the corporate Dems or the Liberal Party of Canada. I couldn't imagine the special place in hell it would be for me to be stuck in a caucus with Liberals in Canada. We are incompatible in our worldviews, my worldviews, with Liberals and liberalism. And so, from that perspective, it's difficult to follow the linear chain of what's happening and blame it on a particular body politic. It's important to note that we gained official opposition at a time when we were allowed to have, there was a public subsidized per vote subsidy for the parties, and we were allowed to have union donations. We are a labor party in Canada. That has changed. And so in 2011, when we had that orange wave, it came on the heels of Jack Layton capturing places like Quebec, where we had these incredible breakthroughs that subsequently, election after election, were whittled away. And instead of the electorate parking their votes with us in 2015, we know what happened with Tom Mulcair, who was in essence a liberal, and we're seeing that now, where we got outflanked on the left, and the Quebec folks parked their votes with liberals, and then after the liberal failure, parked their votes with the Bloc Québécois, who I should add are even perhaps bigger faux-gressives than the liberals.
Yeah. I've always been kind of, I don't know, just kind of amused by the Bloc Québécois, because I feel like they're, I don't know, it feels like this Quebec nationalism is like a whole other thing, and that's why, as another dimension to Canadian politics, of course, because it's almost like it exists in a realm outside of the political spectrum, right? It's not just, but a lot of times it does have
an
a very
identity
right-wing
politics. Like
it's
I would
identity
argue,
politics, yeah.
And here's the deal. This is the thing that I think people are starting to come alive to, is that all politics are identity politics. And it's only been in the emergence of marginalized groups, racialized groups, actually fighting and organizing it at seats at the table, where the hegemonic whiteness of North American politics, I should say, American and Canadian politics, exclusive of, well, no, I would even argue that in Latin American politics, whiteness has a place as well.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Yeah, right. So I would suggest that like the politics of the bloc are not that different than the politics of the Wexit far right prairie class of conservatives, of the granola West Coast New Democrat Green Party, BC crew, of the East Coast oligarchs of the Liberal Party on the East Coast. Those are all identity politics. The only difference is with liberalism, and with liberalism, it's identity politics without the class analysis. And with the bloc, it's identity politics without the race and the language and the religion analysis. It's an ethnocentric nationalism.
It's a very interesting thing for Americans, because we don't really have, for all the far right elements in perhaps the Southeast that say stuff like the Confederacy will rise again or whatever, no one's actually afraid of that. There isn't like a real secessionist movement or a nationalist movement in America. So that kind of dimension is quite unique, I think, for people in the United States.
That's a bold statement to say right now, fam. That's a bold statement. You have people marching on the streets, militias, who are threatening.
Well, I think they're more dangerous than secessionists. I think they want to make the whole country. I think they want to make the whole country. They want to make the whole country that way.
Well, but here's what I would put back.
They would rather all of us be like that. In a way, that's even scarier, because that requires even more violence.
It's been my observation, and you guys would know better than I would, that the American identity is more tied to the state than it is. Like when I see Americans abroad, I say, where are you from? They don't say United States of America. They're like Michigan, New York, Florida, Tennessee, Texas. And the militia movement comes out of a state-based kind of independence that is very different than the experience here in Canada. Most Canadians would say, I'm from Canada, and then they would probably say the city.
Well, I don't know I
Ye-
don't know how that plays in Quebec so much, but well, it also depends what part of Quebec as well. But I would say in America, it's kind of interesting because obviously, like, it is very like big, diverse country, but like the identities of people often maybe I would not put it I would not categorize it maybe as much as by the state, but more by their maybe when what they say would be a state or even a country or a city, but what people tend to identify with is kind of their, I guess, in a sense, like social politics in a way, because people, whether they're from Michigan or Ohio or Georgia or Arkansas, they could identify as someone who's from the real America, which is often a white America, right? Or someone, that's from New York or California could identify with
yeah,
being part of a more progressive America.
yeah.
But
State
I
and
don't think
region
it's
often
maybe,
end up being proxies for
For the
yeah,
politics.
other
yeah,
identity issue, for other
Right.
kinds of identity.
Yeah, I mean, the Electoral College has allowed that to be so, right? Where the division of this like really thin veneer, if you want to call in a so-called democracy, has allowed for that to be so, because the real votes are not weighed in a proportional way to the democracy.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And the Electoral
Another
College,
key difference.
yeah, yeah,
Another horrible example of why our democracy is a bit of a kind of a joke in a way.
Well, it's a nightmare now. Like I'm
Yeah.
looking at it and I'm saying, on the way out, how the effects of a lame duck far right Trump regime could have lasting global implications. This guy has like last-ditch efforts to support, war in Iran, coups around the world, potential annexation of occupied Palestinian territories, all types of horrible things on the way out, because you all couldn't get your shit together, for lack of a better term.
yeah.
Oh
Well,
yeah, definitely.
just
Yeah.
thought today that Mike Pompeo is visiting settlements in the West Bank, which is like the first time an American Secretary of State has ever done that. But
Christo
yeah,
fascism is real. Like the Christian evangelical sects of the United States, who are solely interested in Zionism for the explicit understanding that it takes the elimination of Jews and Muslims from these holy sites for the second coming of Christ, is terrifying.
Yeah, that's
yeah,
That is
something
the
I've
worldview.
definitely.
And it should be terrifying to Jewish
Yes.
Americans as well.
Yes, that's definitely something that unfortunately has been, because in this country the consensus when it comes to Israel and supporting its policies vis-a-vis, basically apartheid in Palestine. The consensus in America is so tight between the two parties and their leaderships around the issue, that it's become practically impossible for even milquetoast liberals who might be totally fine with everything Israel does, but for the reasons of their cultural progressivism should be concerned about the anti-Semitism of the evangelical right, will ignore it. Totally
Yeah,
ignore
we've had scenarios here where they've had patriot walks, which is the far right, language for Proud Boys, yellow vesters marching alongside folks from like the JDL. And it's a really strange thing to see. And it's frightening that the far right in these contexts are unifying, knowing that at the end of the day, one has at the end game, white supremacy and neo-Nazi movements at the end game call for the elimination of Jewish peoples around the world. Like that is frightening for me.
Yeah, like
absolutely.
even
And
here, it has taken acts of terrorism for people to acknowledge that, hey, maybe this Trump guy and the way he talks about minorities and the way he talks about quote unquote globalism is a little on the nose with the anti-Semitism.
Well, it's
It
happening here.
took his supporters killing people for people to actually acknowledge that, and not
Look.
just him saying the anti-Semitic stuff in the first place.
The Quebec City massacre is one of the largest murders in Canadian history. And today in the House of Commons, the Conservative Party is putting out these UN dog whistle Agenda 2030 globalist, the Great Reset, all of these things that you can hearken straight out of Nazi propaganda that target, using the George Soros kind of meme, this trope of Jewish control of the world as a justification, and calling liberalism socialism in very intentional ways to confuse it. But it is extremely dangerous when it's radicalized online.
Well, I was just going to ask Matthew, maybe because obviously I've learned a lot just in the last year since I came here about Canadian politics, but I still don't know anywhere near as much as you would, or as most Americans would not, right? So is there a major like evangelical sect in Canada or not?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Any conservative leadership race relies on capturing a far right evangelical vote that is oftentimes anti-science, anti-vax, anti-immigrant. And it is here for as long as it's been in the States. It is also gerrymandered in terms of the way that ridings and wards have been weighted, because these communities have often stayed in concentrated ways in rural or suburban areas and settings. So you look at the Reformation movement, the Dutch Reform movement, the evangelical movement. We have a Bible Belt in Canada, certainly across the prairies, right? Absolutely. And even into BC. And so that's a real thing. And over the years, it's had many iterations: Reform, the Alliance Party, and now the Conservative Party. And I think that it is part of the challenges that we're facing in COVID in terms of using evidence-based data and research to offset public health measures that would bring this thing in check. That we have a minister who's like 20 years old, Sam Osterhoff, a provincial minister in Ontario, who will go to church events with 40, 50 people and no masks. He's not a minister. He might be a parliamentarian. He might be an assistant minister or a deputy minister provincially. I don't know what his exact title is, but yeah. The only reason why he's elected at 20 is because he's from a community of strong faith that wanted him to go in on a reproductive rights agenda and to represent their values. But you know what? In a democracy, that's okay. That should be allowed to happen, that every community should be able to express themselves democratically. The problem is that with our electoral system, first past the post, these people have found their way into mainstream governments, where in a proportional system, they would be relegated to fringe parties.
Yeah, that's definitely a very good point. Yeah. And it's like the conservative party in Canada has kind of, I've seen, I don't know, maybe you would say that they've always been that way, but I think they've definitely been kind of shifting a bit more towards social conservatism even in the last few years as well.
Yeah, I think that we're in a populist moment. And right now, the populist moment lends itself to like the intersection between the QAnon folks and evangelicals, like to be anti-science, anti-education, or anti-intelligentsia folds in well to a populism that is also conspiracy based, where, you can have a leap of faith and believe in QAnon, but not believe that masks are effective in reducing vaccines, or not believing in COVID at all. So I think that the compatibility between the far right evangelical movements and conspiracy theories that are fueling right-wing populist movements.
And just wondering how we're doing on time here. I don't know how much time you want.
I mean, I'm okay for another 10 or so minutes. I do have to get home and eat, and I have another event at 7.
Okay. All right, perfect. We'll just have about 10 more minutes then. That's awesome. Thank you so much for your time, by the way. It's definitely hard.
What inspired you guys to set up this podcast?
Well, so Nick and I met at a summer camp about 3 years ago, and we've always been like talking about different political issues, and we've always been kind of Nick actually inspired me to become more of a leftist actually, but I just kind of this 2020 with the primaries in the United States that ended up being such a disappointment, and the coronavirus pandemic starting with us having so much more time on our hands at the beginning of the year, we just felt like it would be a good way to kind of just like, talk to different people, and we've had different people on, but mostly just been talking to the two of us and just kind of, doing something else.
Amazing, man. I love it. Like, look, at the end of the day, popular education in leftist spaces is what's needed. The right wing has it down pat. They're dominating social media platforms, starting their own platforms. And so podcasts are one of the ways where, there's perpetuity to the discussion. So we can have this chat here today, and forever it will be out there for people to listen to, ponder, chime in on, refute, debate.
Yeah.
That's cool. Absolutely. Man.
Yeah, like if one day it turns out somehow, if tomorrow somehow QAnon disappears just overnight, somebody, Thanos snaps and their minds are all made normal or relatively normal again. And somebody can actually be like, hey, you didn't have to worry about that as much.
That's right. Yeah.
Which God, I hope, like one could only hope, but unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah. Well, kind of shifting gears a little bit here. We saw this week in Parliament the NDP's wealth tax measure that was resoundingly defeated, even when a lot of polls have shown that large majorities of Canadians support it. And we see this a lot in the U.S. as well.
Majorities of the Conservative Party membership supported it.
Yeah, we've seen a lot in the U.S. as well, where
one of those things in the United
States policies are very popular in polls, but the exact opposite happens at the government level. So I was wondering maybe if you could just speak on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not popular within the fundraising circles of partisan major political parties, Democrats, conservatives, Republicans, liberals alike. There's no appetite for them to bite the hands that feed them. These are Coke or Pepsi decisions that are made. It's not by chance. They're both red and blue in the United States and in Canada. They are Coke or Pepsi decisions that are made because at the end of the day, Bay Street or Wall Street could care less who's in government. As long as it's business as usual, to borrow from President-elect Joe Biden, as long as it's business as usual. And so, when we presented I would call it a paltry 1% flat wealth tax. I do support, there's another, proposal that's out there that looked at Warren and Sanders, and then the Canadian example, including our own policies, led by the Center for Canadian Progress. And I would suggest that a progressive wealth tax that has bigger bands in terms of who it encapsulates would be necessary in order to get the kind of revenues in to help offset some of our social programs, because we need to have investments in social programs. And if we don't, what we're facing down the barrel of the austerity gun, which is going to result in increasing cuts to social programs at the expense or for the expense of cuts to the ultra wealthy and the continued tax loopholes for most of our major corporations. $37 billion of wealth was created during COVID in Canada. Bezos is about to be a trillionaire. Weston's and the food producers and the grocers who have been accused of fixing prices in the past. Shout out to Pete, Mayor Pete.
Pete Buttigieg. You worked for a company that was fixing bread prices.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. Look, we have to go to those who have the most and who made the most to pay the most. It's a very basic premise of what I think anybody can agree is a democratic economy. That while everybody was asked to sacrifice and stay home and take, peanuts, the elephants continue to get fat. Or donkeys, whatever,
Yeah, whatever.
We don't have animals in Canada for our parties, and I wish we had. I wish we had better mascots for our parties.
Yeah, you can't really say, the maple leaves are getting fatter. It doesn't really
No.
work the same way.
No, but I do talk about the maple washed version of Canada, which plays in nicely.
Well, yeah, you could just maybe expand on that for a second.
Well, this just goes to Canadian exceptionalism, where what we like to do is look to the States and see how much of a gong show it is and say it can always be worse. But God damn it, if we're using Donald Trump as our litmus test for what is normal or what is, acceptable, we're in deep, deep trouble. If we're using any of the American policies as being the litmus test for progressivism, we're in deep, deep trouble. And so we like to do that rather than judge ourselves on ourselves. We like to look to the States as a scapegoat. Liberals love this because this, you could always get worse, is the way in which they justify pandering to the unicorn Republican swing votes that are never going to come, by the way, instead of speaking to their leftist base. And it's the same in Canada with conservative liberals and liberal conservatives.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that you hit the nail on the head there. Like, I mean, just the absolute level of people in Canada that I've seen, and not just people in Canada, but it's a lot of people in the US as well that are nominally on the left, but they always talk about, oh, Canada, and not just Canada, but a lot of the countries in Europe as well that are, they have, moderately more social programs than the United States does, but they still engage in a lot of the same kind of just, extractive policies around the globe. And I know yourself and Leah Gazan from Winnipeg have been talking about this kind of Canadian role in foreign policy as well. And I think it's important to recognize that, Canada is not innocent as much as it would like to say it is.
Oh God, no. All of the mining sector dollars come out of Bay Street. Like we can say all we want about climate change, and they can talk about clean energy and all this other stuff. And they talk about our net per capita contributions to global climate change, but they don't talk about the impacts of the exports on global climate change. Like, we maple wash our version of ourselves abroad in ways in which are horrible. It's horrible. We've been involved in right-wing coups all over Latin America. Like, that's a fact. So, being lapdogs of the United States regime is not in our best interest, nor is it in the global interest.
Yes, definitely. Being strapped on to this sort of slowly dying hegemon here that the United States is, and being dragged in, joining us in our, quixotic efforts to install Juan Guaido, who's been completely abandoned even by his own party in Venezuela. Like, that kind of stuff is definitely not in the best interest. It's not in the best interest of America, which tries to lead, loudly and proudly leads the charge on a lot of these things, but also, is definitely not in the best interest of, the average Canadian. Right.
And shout out to you for using quixotic. I thought that was really well played, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Looks like we're coming to the end of our time here. So if you have any closing statement or anything.
Just to anybody who's out there, I think that this platform that you guys have set up is great. I would invite anybody to connect with me on Twitter at Matthew, 2 T's, Matthew, Green, Green, NDP, on Twitter, on Facebook, I'm even on Twitch, and Instagram. And I'm doing these series called Parle to the People, where I try to connect people to the process of government. And it's manifested in a bunch of different ways, but I just invite you to check out that hashtag PARL to the people, Parliament to the people.
Yeah, I noticed that on your Twitter. Yeah, that's definitely what we need more of.
Sounds very, very interesting, actually. Thank you.
Yeah, no doubt. Thanks for having me on.
So much. Thanks for your time, and thanks for fighting for everyday Canadians, because we definitely need more of you in Parliament.
And Americans living in Canada.
People. Yes, exactly. Everyone living. Hey, and yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Matthew, and thanks everyone for listening to this.
Be well.